extremes of a young woman. They cleared her room she was working in, took her into another room with 4 senior officers who were all male, and demanded she sign a piece of paper that said she wouldn't follow a lawful order. And they kept her there until she would sign it. She had just come back from stress leave. The worst example was a young man around the time of the convoy. So you know how cold it was. He was forced to be outside for 3 months on duty while his co-workers were name-calling. They'd be at the window saying things to him. He lasted 3 months before he finally broke psychologically.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. Today, my very special guest is Christensen, and she is very unique in the fact that she's got experience with a couple of different things. First and foremost, she started off her professional career as a registered nurse, and then later on in life, went back to law school and became a lawyer. And right now, she has the I don't want to say distinct privilege, or I could say misfortune, of representing many Canadian Armed Forces members in a class action lawsuit against the federal government and the Canadian Armed Forces themselves. So welcome to the show, and thank you for your time, because I know, with lawyers, time is money and you guys are very expensive. So thanks for being generous.
Happy to be here, Tom.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.
Right. So you and I, you kind of came onto our radar after the convoy in Ottawa because we started to see what was happening to members of the Canadian military, and with something called a 5F category, which is a dishonorable discharge. And there's some strange wording in the writing of that, a dishonorable discharge because of personal weakness. Now, as a former military person, I find that language in this particular case to be highly, highly offensive. So,
as did many of your peers.
Yes. So the first question I want to ask you is approximately, this class action lawsuit that you're involved with, you're representing several Canadian Armed Forces members, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is the lawsuit against the Canadian military or the Canadian government?
Well, first of all, it's I want to clarify, it's not actually a class action.
Right.
It's actually a mass tort.
A mass tort.
So that means
okay.
that the named plaintiffs are the ones that are going to move forward with the lawsuit. And should it settle or we win, then they share in that equally. But no one else can apply for that settlement like they would in a class action.
Okay.
That being said, if we're successful, there'll be more lawsuits to come to follow up.
Yeah.
But the lawsuit is against the king, because when you sue the government, you sue the king.
Okay.
He's also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It's against the Ministry of National Defense. So Ms. Anand and Ms. Thomas, who was deputy minister when all of this happened. And then it's against several generals. Air to top the list, and then the vice chief of defense staff, the commander of the Army, commander of Navy, commander of the Air Force, and then who else? I just looked at that statement of claim. There's also General Rutland. He was a colonel at the time. He was brigade commander out here in Edmonton, and he did some really unpleasant things to his people specifically that I have named him as well.
Good.
So it's quite a list.
And I want to get into that with the understanding that obviously we don't want to reveal strategy. And, I obviously want to, under the Privacy Act, there's things we can't disclose, but for things that are public domain and public knowledge, that's, fair game. But so how many roughly are on this mass tort that you're involved with? How many soldiers?
Approximately 350 active duty and veterans.
Wow.
Because some of them, of course, were kicked out.
Right.
Or voluntarily released, if you know what I mean.
Right, right.
About 350.
Wow.
Every branch, right from Army, Navy, Air Force, Rangers, cadet cadre, RMC.
Right.
I've got everybody's covered.
And are you finding, is it closed now, or are there people are still allowed to sort of come forward and join in on this?
The first one is now closed,
Okay.
but I do have a waiting list. As you can imagine, as word has been getting out about all of this, we're starting to get lots of inquiries, especially after the decision by the External Grievance Committee.
Right.
So we've developed a waiting list.
Okay. Yeah, I did a video about the grievance committee last week where I was talking about, I think I called the video the intentional managed decline of the Canadian Armed Forces, something along those lines, because you know, we're in a situation with the Canadian Forces. I think the attrition rate, meaning the people leaving the Canadian military versus new ones coming in, but the people leaving the Canadian military is somewhere around 18.5% right now. And they're struggling greatly in this country to recruit new people coming into the military. I think, for example, one of the ships, one of our frigates, had to do their own recruiting drive to get people to come on, like literally get on board that ship as trained sailors. Because they're for a year, yeah, because they're not getting enough people coming into the recruiting centers because they can't. And we can talk a little bit about why that is. But so we're in a situation with the Canadian military where not only are they not coming in the door, but the ones that we have trained are exiting at a rate of about 18.5%. And some of these trained people, for example, I know of a highly skilled, highly trained helicopter pilot who only had 4 years left to go before he qualified for his military pension and benefits, was 5F'd, kicked out of the Air Force for refusing, and I'm going to refer to it as the experimental injection, because he refused to have his bodily autonomy violated, as well as he believed that the government or the military had no possible conceivable way to meet the standard of informed consent. So obviously I have to be very careful in the way I phrase these things, because I've already got one strike from YouTube last week for telling the truth. So, you know, I know of another case. There's a female soldier in the Canadian military who was 7 months away from her retirement, was kicked out 5F. And I hear these stories all the time. So, you know, for the viewers, you have to do 25 years in the military to qualify for a pension. And it's approximately, you know, 50% of your best 5 years of service. That is the amount of your pension. So if you do 25 years, you get 50% of your pay for the rest of your life plus medical benefits. So, you know, we've got a case where one of our military members was 7 months away from receiving her eligibility for pension and was kicked out of the military for personal weakness because she did not. Yeah, moral weakness.
Moral weakness. For something within their control.
Yes.
Some of the language has been used, yes.
So the language is rather disturbing in bullying, and we're going to get into the bullying. We're definitely going to get into the bullying because
there was lots of it.
yes. And from my perspective, the things that I've heard that I have trouble confirming because I'm not in the military anymore. But I think the commanders that are doing the things that I've heard rumored to have been happening, if they are true, I believe that those commanders should be, I think they should be horsewhipped as well as relieved of duty, demoted in rank, charged at the very least, and removed from the Canadian military. But I'm not in control of that. What do I know? I'm just a fired software teacher from a college.
That's right.
So
I don't know. You got that retired behind your name.
Yeah, I can say that. I can say that, but that's a whole different episode. So let's talk about what's happening on the basis. What are the stories that you're hearing? So we to set this up, we have the Canadian military comes out with a experimental injection mandate, and that is an order or a directive given by the Chief of Defence Staff, and that is the highest ranking military member within the Canadian Forces, who answers to the Minister of National Defence. The Minister of National...
Not really.
Well...
answers to the king.
To the king.
But that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, but in sort of the succession, you've got the Prime Minister, you have another elected official who's a member of Parliament, and right now she is a member of Parliament who was given the portfolio of being the Minister of National Defence, and the Chief of Defence Staff, the highest ranking general, reports to her, and the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. And I know there's some other different relationships in there as well. But so we've got that sort of set up. The federal government comes out with a mandate. So General Eyre, who's the current Chief of Defence Staff, issues a directive telling all Canadian Forces members they have, I believe from what I read, 14 days to comply with an official order to go and participate or take part in this experimental injection or face consequences. So I'm going to kind of break that down to two parts, because there's what the reaction is of the senior leadership within the Canadian military and how they're treating the soldiers after that directive comes out. And then there's, the bigger picture, the broader implications, and when we get into that grievance case that we found out on the 30th of May. So if you can, I'd like for you to kind of describe what you're hearing, because you're out in Edmonton, Alberta right now. And so there's a large brigade, a base in Edmonton, Alberta. That's your closest military installation. So I'd like, if you could, to describe for the viewers some of the things that you have heard that the leadership or the chain of command has done to soldiers that do not want to participate in this.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting because there were very ambitious officers in the command ranks who saw this as an opportunity to basically step on their own troops to get that promotion. Mm-hmm. An example of that was the brigade commander at CFB Edmonton, he's based at CFB Edmonton, but the Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group out here was Colonel Rutland. He's now a brigadier general. Mm-hmm. He became a brigadier general by setting up a review board that reviewed every single accommodation request of anyone who was under his command, which went against the Chief of Defence Staff directive, because the directive said that the commanding officers were on the ground were the ones who were supposed to make the decision on accommodations. What was happening is they were getting accommodations, and that wasn't supposed to happen. So I'll call him Brigadier General Rutland now, set up this review board of people who were not cleared to see any medical information, certainly not personal information, to review all these requests. And I haven't seen anybody be accommodated by that review board. Let's put it that way. They basically rejected them all. Mm-hmm. I've seen some very interesting explanations. Apparently, on a balance of probabilities, someone's faith and religion can't be harmed by accepting the medical treatment that they were being ordered to take. I don't know how you assess someone's faith on a balance of probabilities. Mm-hmm.
Well,
that one caught my attention.
Yeah, that's interesting because, religion is one of the 13 prohibited grounds of discrimination, within Canadian law. And the other thing is the Privacy Act is another federal act that comes into play here. I know when I was in the military, I was not authorized in any way, shape, or form to see the medical files of any soldier under my command, and nor was I required to turn over my own medical information to the chain of command.
Right.
I mean, I had seen, I was injured in a parachute accident. I had hip surgery. Yes, the chain of command knew that the doctor was putting me on sick leave, but they give you the chit that tells you the duration of the time. They don't tell you what your medical information is about.
Exactly.
Especially when it comes to mental health issues. That's not something that is covered, or the business of your chain of command. If a doctor gives the order and says, this is the way it's going to be, the chain of command has no right to overrule that. But yet, we get into this situation, and it seems like not only medical ethics are thrown out the window, but the Privacy Act and one of the 13 grounds of discrimination is thrown out the window. So,
right. Well, and you talk about private medical information. Pregnant women had their privacy completely blown out of the water from the base surgeon calling their obstetricians to say, you're not going to let her have any leave, even for a high-risk pregnancy, because she's just using this to get out of what has been ordered. So one of them was even charged AWOL because she was hospitalized. I mean, we're getting into things. One was told she couldn't have maternity leave. By law, she's allowed maternity leave. Another was told, well, the Army likes to keep their pregnant women. How did the nurse put it? The Army likes to keep their pregnant women working as long as possible.
Well, that's great as a policy.
You want to recruit more women into the military?
Yeah. But that's great as a policy, but it's not good in terms of medical privacy and healthcare.
And speaking of medical privacy got thrown out the window with this directive, there were several directives, but everyone was required to put their vaccination status into what's called Monitor Mass, which is a general portal. It was not protected B at the time, not meant for personal, private information, and everyone's information went on. And I've got hundreds of affidavits that will confirm that everyone could see what your vaccination status was, which of course, not only is that a privacy issue, but that also led to discrimination, bullying, harassment, because everybody knew.
Right.
From seeing it. I mean, I've got commanding officers that were putting theirs in at the last minute because they didn't think it was any business of anyone below them to know their vaccination status.
Right.
So,
did you find that there was a certain amount of, let's say, your clientele that are coming from the medical system within the Canadian military? Because we have military doctors and nurses and technicians and everything. Are any of your clients, without names obviously, but any of your clients coming from the medical trade within the Canadian military?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, doctors and technicians and nurses.
Good.
Very much so, because they were basically told not to report adverse events.
Right.
They were basically told that absolutely no one was to get a medical accommodation. Even someone who had already had an injury from an injection the first time, with the first dose, where the medical command was they did not get a chit to get out of a second. So, yeah.
Wow.
And injuries weren't to be reported.
Right.
I've even got on my list people that will testify to the psychological operations that were happening at the time.
Are any of your clients injured?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Obviously, we're trying to be very cautious here about getting strikes, but is there a percentage? Would you say that there's a percentage of your clients that have been injured?
So I limited how many injured members there were in this particular lawsuit, because there's another lawsuit coming just for the injured.
Got it.
But there were a few that I would say, just quickly thinking about numbers, 5 to 7%.
Okay. Okay.
Keeping in mind that most of my clients did not did not go for the treatment. So of those that did, there's a significant number that, and the adverse events are quite severe.
Right.
Yeah. Life-changing events.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about harassment, because you mentioned that earlier, and I have heard many unsubstantiated cases, and I don't like to delve into rumors, especially in the military, because it's it's a very fertile ground.
It's a hotbed of gossip.
It certainly is. It's the first time I ever heard the rumor mill, the rumor mill, was from the military. So yes, it's full of rumors and barrack room lawyers. So I want to be very careful. So what are some of the extreme cases of harassment that you may have heard, amongst your clientele?
From things such as someone on paternity leave called me and said there's 2 men in uniform downstairs and they are demanding that I sign paperwork. What do I do? And keep talking to me on the phone till they leave, because in Canada we don't have people in uniform showing up demanding you sign papers.
No,
not the Canada I want to live in anyway.
Exactly.
To people being told that they would never be able to work again and their families would starve, that they were basically going to get throwing their life away, they'd lose their pensions, which wasn't true, not with that release category. Then we get to extremes of a young woman they cleared the room she was working in with her coworkers, sent them all home, took her into another room with 4 senior officers who were all male, and demanded she sign a piece of paper that said she wouldn't follow a lawful order. And they kept her there until she would sign it, which was quite a bit of time. And she had just come back. Yeah, she had just come back from stress leave. So,
great.
This is, I think there's a word for that, interrogation. You'd be questioned about it.
Yeah.
The worst example, though, and this was, of all my clients, this has been nominated as the worst story, was a young man in Quebec in January, or around about January, just around the time of the Convoy. So how cold it was.
It was.
He's in Quebec, and he was forced to be outside for 3 months on duty while his coworkers were walking past him, name-calling, giving him jibes. They'd be at the window, saying things to him through the window from inside the building. He lasted 3 months, lost about 20 to 30 pounds of muscle mass before he finally broke psychologically and voluntarily released.
Right.
But I'll be honest with you, in my mind, that was physical torture.
Well,
that commanding officer,
I had heard very similar stories across the other brigades as well. So Petawawa, Edmonton, as well as Quebec, that the soldiers that refused to participate in the experiment were not allowed to enter any of the indoor spaces where there was other soldiers who did participate. And at one point they were being required to wear their DEUs, or their dress uniforms, out in a modular tent that was placed outside. And at one point I've been told that in Petawawa they removed the heaters from those soldiers that were in their dress uniforms in a tent outside in the winter. I don't, soldiers are used to dealing or having to adapt to extreme weather conditions. But I think this goes far beyond that. This is where you're deliberately isolating and segregating soldiers and treating them like lepers, as opposed to members of your team that just have the self-respect and the critical thinking skills to abide by their own autonomy, bodily autonomy. And, you know, a lot of people think, hey, you get all these other procedures done all throughout your career. The difference being is that those other procedures have a long track record. They are approved federally, and not in every case, because we've got 2 cases where, you know, medication was distributed to soldiers and they were harmed. Mefloquine is one that comes to mind. And there's a case where Sergeant Kipling, and we'll be careful here, Sergeant Kipling, it was an Air Force sergeant at one point, there was experimental drug for the anthrax, whatever you want to call that. Just don't use that word for anthrax. And he was court-martialed. And, you know, he finally retired from the military. They brought him back as a civilian and court-martialed him. And he won his case. And basically on the grounds that you could not actually meet the standard of informed consent because you don't have the long-term safety data is one of the issues. But, you know, when the ruling came down, they basically said, how is it that soldiers are expected to fight for freedom, the charter, personal liberties, but they're not allowed to participate in them? You know, where is the protection for the soldiers against the state, against, you know, their government? And so this... Well,
just because you swear an oath to serve the Queen doesn't mean you gave up your rights. That's not part of the oath.
Exactly. I mean, soldiers understand that in combat situations, because of unlimited liability, you can lawfully be ordered on a very high risk mission that may result in your certain death. That's within the realm of combat operations in warfare. But in peacetime, we don't act or conduct ourselves in this way. And we certainly don't harass and belittle soldiers anymore. I mean, I joined the reserves in 1990. And that's when all the Human Rights Act stuff came in. You couldn't even give a soldier push-ups unless you were down as the instructor doing them beside them. Right. So things changed, you know, 33 years ago. And here we are treating soldiers in such a harassing manner that, you know, they're literally pushing people out the door. They're kicking them out on a 5F, but they're harassing them in order to get them to leave as well. And then the irony is that General Eyre goes on the news a few months ago and he begs the public to join and serve the Canadian military because the numbers are so down. While simultaneously warmongering against Eastern Europe. So, you know, this is why we refer to it as the managed decline of the Canadian Armed Forces, because it seems like there's a concerted effort to deliberately do everything you can to harm the operational readiness of your military forces within this country.
Yes. I mean, this whole thing, since Eyre became acting CDS, we've seen nothing but hardcore damage to the Canadian Armed Forces. They went through the decade of darkness in the 90s where the Liberal government stripped them out of a lot of things. And they managed to regroup and regain back because of Afghanistan in 2001. In my opinion, right now, we couldn't do that today.
No.
The forces have been so destroyed that if we were called upon to do another Afghanistan next week, it couldn't be done. It just couldn't be done.
You know, look at the situation that's happening right now. You've got a battle group deployed to Latvia. They're training in Latvia, and yet they can't even afford to give them helmets. Soldiers, it was reported in the media recently that soldiers are buying their own helmets, right? There's another issue in Poland. They sent 25 soldiers to train Ukrainian forces in the 4 Leopard tanks that we gave them. And they didn't send any cooks with them. So our soldiers didn't even have meals. They didn't have cooks. So they told them, okay, go out and eat on the economy. And yet then they refused to reimburse them for the food. So
That happened in Hawaii as well.
Yeah, and I'm mentioning this because this government, the Liberal government right now, has loaned Ukraine $2 billion. They donated $400 million worth of Patriot missile systems. And last week, Trudeau surprisingly showed up in Ukraine and gave them $500 million more of our taxpayers' funds. And we've got soldiers that are not getting fed and don't even have helmets. And there's talk that Justin Trudeau wants to increase the size of the forces in Latvia to a full brigade. We can't put together a full brigade. We can't put together a full brigade in any three of our super bases in Canada. So how are we going to do that?
They couldn't put together 100 people to fight fires.
Exactly.
They were strapped to find 100 people to do firefighting duty.
Right.
Yeah.
You had mentioned to me recently about General Air showing up to an airfield, and they couldn't get enough people to clean off the runway.
Yeah, so he had to divert and drive to that base.
So here we have...
that's pretty humiliating. The chief of defense staff can't even land at his own base.
Yeah, because they don't have enough people to clean off the runway. And yet we're going to warmonger in an Eastern European country against a superpower. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's
pretty bad.
Yeah, we could.
So I want to confirm for you that the Petawawa story is true.
Yes.
I have a sworn affidavit that says it was true, that they actually did do that.
Yeah.
It happened in Halifax as well. They put a bunch of people in a small room and kept them there for weeks.
Yes.
There were some threats to life out of that particular group.
And my understanding is in Petawawa itself, they weren't doing this to just brand new people off the street. They were doing this to people that had, combat tours who have served their country in combat. This is the way they were treating their own veterans within their own ranks. And we're talking all ranks, all enlisted ranks and junior officers. So this isn't, you're picking on the new guy because he's not strong enough to carry the C9 machine gun. You're doing this to hardened combat veterans that have served their country honorably, and this is the way you're treating them now. Like, this is the state of the military.
I've got clients with chests full of, they've got chests full of medals. I've got like colonels who were deprived of a promotion to colonel and their own command over this.
Right.
So, and then it goes right down every rank. But they were really hit hard in those senior NCO ranks, the ones that would train. If you had to conscript a bunch of people next week, these would be the battle-hardened people that would train them to survive.
Right.
And they're gone.
Right.
And they are not coming back. Right. I can tell you that for sure. Nobody's coming back who's gone.
So the CDS directive, recently a grievance board. So for just to kind of enlighten the audience, there was I think a young member, a master corporal, who filed a grievance against the chain of command for imposing these mandates. Unfortunately, the member, due to extreme pressure, did eventually participate in the experiment, but still the grievance went forward. And recently, on May 30th of 2023, a grievance board found that the directive from the CDS down the chain of command violated not only the members. I think it's clear to distinguish. So it was a specific case, but the findings have broader implications across the Canadian Armed Forces, in that the grievance board found that these directives violated Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for all of our military members. Now, that's not legally binding. It's not a court of law. It's a grievance board. But it did recommend that the Chief of Defense and the senior staff of the military rescind all directives and orders related to mandates. That's my understanding of the situation.
And here's where this hits in a much broader impact, is that the National Defense Act says that the Chief of Defense Staff cannot make an order which violates a charter right. So by doing this and this finding,
Right.
it's basically laid the groundwork to say that directive was an unlawful order, and it was people were beat over the heads with this is a lawful order. You're not following a lawful command. Nobody was charged, by the way, for a court martial to test that theory. Probably because they were a little concerned. I have General Eyre's briefing note.
Right.
I know what he was told, and he was told this was not legal.
Yeah.
It was not medically.
I remember this.
He was told no.
Yeah. I remember reading about this, that he was given legal counsel, that what he was about to do was not legal, and he pushed forward with it anyway.
Yes.
The other part? What's the future of General Eyre looking like these days? What's in store for him?
I am expecting him to fall on his sword soon.
Okay.
I've heard that he was already planning on retiring.
Okay.
So, it's going to be interesting for me because the favorite Liberal line is something to do with sexual misconduct. That's their favorite thing. I don't think that's going to happen to General Eyre.
Right.
I think he's been a loyal soldier to someone other than the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes.
And I think he'll be rewarded for it.
I think so.
To be honest.
I think so.
Yeah.
That
doesn't mean I'm not going to question him under oath.
Good.
I don't care where he is in the world. I'll find him.
when I was, in 2007, I did the Command and Staff College in Kingston. And towards the end, they brought General Eyre. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he's an expert in coin operations, so counterinsurgencies. He's not a lightweight, and he's got a lot of grit. I mean, he's done the Special Forces course in the United States, so the Green Beret course. The failure rate on that course is extremely high, but he graduated. He's a tough guy. He's no pushover. He's highly educated. He's very experienced, and yet, when I first heard of him when he was presenting at the staff college in 2007, a lot of the junior officers on the course that knew who he was spoke very, very highly of him. As he's climbed the ranks, he was a brigade commander. I've heard some other issues, but that's you can't please everybody. But I was very concerned when we had this time in the Canadian military where we kept going through, like every few months, we've got a new chief of defense staff. And he was the commander of the army at the time, and he was put in the acting position of chief of defense staff. And I think within 6 months or so, it was fully substantiated, and he was given the job as the current chief of defense staff, and he's held the post for a while. Yeah,
within a few weeks after he brought in the first directive.
Right, exactly. So, there's a lot of theory out there that the previous people did not really have an interest in violating informed consent, or certainly didn't want to violate anybody's charter rights, and yet they're all gone, and he remained and issued the order. Yes. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. And I'm speculating.
Even the general who wrote his briefing note was removed.
Really, that's interesting.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes, his briefing note was written by General Trevor Cadieux.
Okay. Trevor Cadieux is a JAG, is he not? He's a lawyer?
No. He was a general.
Okay.
From the Army. He was a Patricia.
Okay.
He was out here in Edmonton.
Yep.
Know him well.
Okay.
And he wrote the briefing note with all the advisors. Mm-hmm. And he said to General Eyre, "You can't do this.
Right.
You cannot do this under Canadian law. You can't do it under medical ethics. Mm-hmm. You can't do it morally.
Yeah.
No. This is, and it's pretty much the same briefing note that was given to Admiral MacDonald, mm-hmm. who then said, "No, I'm not bringing in a mandate."
Right.
And we all know what happened to Admiral MacDonald.
Yes.
General Vance said no as well.
Yes.
Yes.
It's a little bit sneaky.
And so General Fortin.
Yeah, General Fortin. So here's an interesting thing, right? We have 12 senior officers of the rank of, I think 2 of them were colonels. The rest were brigadier and higher. And yet, under the current liberal government, we've seen 12 of their careers get destroyed. I know one of the officers who had his career ended. He was the former commander of the Canadian Special Operations Command, which is extremely bizarre to me because that particular general is one of the few senior leaders in the military that I always viewed as the example of what it meant to be of an exemplary officer. And, this individual gave his blood, sweat, and tears and the life of his brother in combat to this country. And, it's ridiculous to see the treatment of the senior officers by the Liberal government. And you can't say that there's 12 senior officers who have all been involved in sexual scandals or misconduct of some sort or another. And yet
Isn't that a coincidence?
Isn't that a coincidence? All throughout the entire time of General Ayer's tenureship as the CDS, we're seeing soldiers at every rank level below his level being removed or harassed. It's funny how that is. And that's why we refer to it as the managed decline of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes.
So
if they were looking for force reduction, they've got it.
Yes.
Because we have less than 40,000 and we should have 98,000.
Yes. We've got, the NYPD, the police department in New York City, is 35,000 officers. And
so we're not much higher than that for our entire country. And that's all branches.
That not only is that all branches, but that's all support workers as well, right? So if you're in the Army, it doesn't mean that you're at the pointy end of weapons. You're a clerk, you're a cook, you're a mechanic, you're a weapons technician. The number of
all listed on my list of plaintiffs.
Yes,
they're all there.
Yes. And so when we
finance clerks, human resources clerks, port divers, the ones that keep our ports clear and safe.
Yeah. So where does your lawsuit go from there? Where does it currently sit right now, and what's next?
So it's prepared for filing. So we're waiting for that bomb to drop. I certainly hope that no one in Ottawa planned a summer vacation. It's several hundred pages long, not several hundred, just under a couple hundred pages long. So from there, then we would expect to get a statement of defense from the Crown. They get 30 days. They can have an extra 10 days to respond to that. And then from there, we get a reply in 10 days, and then we start moving into exchanging documents. The Crown's probably going to bring a summary dismissal motion to try and get the lawsuit tossed out. Considering how many claims we have, that's a couple of pages. Right. It's going to be hard for them to get the whole thing thrown out.
Right.
And then from there, we move into questioning. That's where I get my chance under oath to putting these senior officers under oath and making them answer some very tough questions.
Good.
In particular, since I have a nursing background, the Surgeon General is going to be in for an interesting time.
Nice.
The Chaplain General is going to be in for an interesting time because according to him, there's only 25 authorized religions in the Canadian Armed Forces. I think our Supreme Court made it clear that there could be more than 25. Yeah. So.
Okay, so you just opened up the door for me on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Yes. We have a former Justice Brown who has recently resigned from the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yes.
From my understanding, he has a long relationship with protecting the rights of people under informed consent.
Yes.
It's interesting to me that somebody with his experience and his education, in his success as a federal judge, a judge on the Supreme Court, is the one judge on that Supreme Court right now who is actually an expert on informed consent. And it's very bizarre to me.
And medical litigation.
Medical litigation,
in general.
yes. It's interesting to me that of all of the judges on the Supreme Court, he's the one who has just resigned.
Yes. He's also a conservative.
Okay. Exactly. Yes.
he's a conservative justice, and I was actually looking forward to. He had a stellar reputation as a justice on the bench. People were known to that if you were going to get. If he was on your file, you better know your stuff because you're going to be put through the ringer. He's a very intelligent man. His questions were very, he was a tough cookie. And I know that very well because he was my torts professor in law school. And that's not cake. That's that's actual law term. And I also did independent legal research with him on informed consent. So I was very aware of his take on informed consent. And I knew that he was probably looking forward to some of these cases starting to hit the Supreme Court, which is just about time for them too. So when I first heard this, there was something going on there. I did not believe anything to it because this is not the law professor that I knew. It's not the man I knew. It's not the justice I knew. And so now I hear he's resigned. It's like, oh, okay, another coincidence. Hits. I don't believe the allegations against him at all.
No,
that's just not the person that I know.
No, and so, we could, look at coincidences all day long. That would be be another episode just to look at coincidences. But if we look at the conduct, the record of the current Liberal government, you know what they say about lying, right? The more you lie, it's harder to track your lies. So this is why you end up getting caught, because you can't remember all the lies after a while. And I see the Liberal government right now being hammered on all sides, from everything from SNC Lavalin, that's reared its ugly head again. There are only so many, the Chinese interference, the police stations, the threats to, members of parliament. There are only so many times, though, where you can cheat so blatantly that even the media can't cover up for you. And I look at, for example, the Public Order Emergency Commission. I did a video about that, and I showed the evidence. I showed it right on the video where you have, Injustice Rouleau literally saying to a lawyer, admonishing the lawyer for the fact that he said, look, it's been widely established that the government did not meet one of the four conditions of the Emergency Act. And then when he came out and presented the evidence at the end of the commission, he actually said the government met the very high threshold to invoke the act. It's like, and then you find out that he's got ties to the Trudeau government in the family. We've got David Johnston's ties to the Liberal, the foundation, the Trudeau Foundation, to the government. It's one scandal after another. So at this point, it's not outside the realm of possibilities that the Liberals have outsmarted somebody and removed one of the judges on the Supreme Court of Canada, which is by no means an easy thing to do. I mean, it's one thing to resign. Right. It's brutal to try to think you can get a judge off the Supreme Court.
Well, and especially Justice Brown was a young man, relatively speaking, for a justice. He had decades ahead of him as a Supreme Court justice.
Right. And if you look at the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court right now, he's I can't comprehend how this guy made it to the top of the pile. We saw during the convoy that his statements were so inflammatory. In his public, the things he was saying about the convoy were I don't know how he wasn't just removed. But then again, it's like it's an act of God to get a judge off the Supreme Court. So,
it's a judge removed. It takes a lot to get him for judge.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, where were the people from my profession when we had the Chief Justice expressing his opinion on something that very likely could end up appearing in front of him?
Yes.
That is such a huge no-no. Like, that is not supposed to happen. But this is the same man who accepted being a temporary governor general while also holding the seat as Chief Justice of Canada.
Right. Mm.
So we want to talk about division of powers.
Yes.
So our legislative branch and judicial branch,
Exactly.
were the same man.
Yes.
The same man. And when I started to talk about it, people even in the legal profession looked at me like I was crazy. And I'm saying, no, hold on.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering my constitutional law properly,
Yes.
this should not happen at all. And yet our Chief Justice saw no problem with accepting that role as Governor General. So I said, like, what happens if he signs into law something that Parliament has passed, and then that law is challenged in the Supreme Court?
Mm-hmm.
Is it already It's already been accepted because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court signed it?
Mm-hmm. And how could he?
Nobody's answering my question.
He can't function. He can't function as somebody who's being objectively impartial. If that ruling were to come to his court, he would have to recuse himself from the case. And now you have a Supreme Court without a Chief Justice. This is fourth grade level thinking. I'm even Americans, because Americans are much better at teaching civics to their population than we are. Probably a third grader would have picked that argument apart and went, wait a minute. I thought there was supposed to be a separation of powers. Anyway, that there's so many episodes we could do about this.
I know. The other piece of it is that our Supreme Court has 9 justices for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's so that if a decision needs to be made, there's always a majority.
Yes.
So if you've removed one, you're now at 8,
yes.
which makes a possibility of a decision being a 4-4 split.
Mm-hmm.
And the Chief Justice's role, does he get a veto?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and then if he recuses himself, we're back to 7, so we're good on the numbers like that. But there's all these things that have implications.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for instance, Brian Peckford's case has gone for appeal. Mm-hmm. Very likely will end up in front of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Right.
And, there we are. I used to watch Americans with how political their Supreme Court was and thought, well, some of our justices are nominated by different parties, but we didn't seem to have that really openly political Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Although McLaughlin was pretty liberal, I have to tell you, she legislated from the bench quite strongly. Right. But now I'm watching this and I'm thinking, oh my God, what happened in the States happened here.
Yes.
So
yes, I mean, people all the time, speaking of judges, feel that judges should be elected because they are in America. If you have to be an elected judge. Same thing with district attorneys. Here we like to appoint people, but in the United States, they're elected. Even for judges, Supreme Court judges, they have to go through a Senate confirmation hearing. And then we find out that they can't really articulate what a woman is on national TV, right?
Wow,
because they're not biologists. Yeah. Way to think on your feet. But, we're...
I'd have got hammered in a courtroom if I'd given an answer like that to the bench.
Exactly. So, I mean, I'm not really in favor of electing judges because I know one of the dynamics in the United States that has happened is that in order for district attorneys and judges to get reelected, they have to be seen as being hard on or tough on crime. And so what happens is they err more on the side of more extreme punishments because they're trying to get reelected to keep their jobs in the future. So unfortunately, what happens is that dynamic in a lot of American states and cities becomes inherently racist because, you've got low-hanging fruit. It's easier to put a visible minority in prison and pad your stats for the next reelection. So I'm that's a very dangerous thing to do. I think we could find probably a better system of appointing judges, or at least putting through a more rigorous process, maybe. I don't know what it is, but from where I'm sitting, my perspective, my observation across this country is that the judges in this country have had their own heads so far up their own asses. It's like they're not even practicing law. I don't know what they're practicing. They're so intent to abide by judicial notice, that they abdicated their responsibilities to be a judge, and they deferred to not medical experts, medical bureaucrats, disguised as experts.
Well, when a justice says, well, that I'm going to take judicial notice that that's a fact because the government says it's true, that's a scary statement. That's a terrifying statement.
That is.
To anybody who believes in democracy, that is a terrifying statement. Because if we take out what that issue was, and we plant another issue in there instead, the screaming would have been deafening.
Yes, it's cowardice.
If he said that, to use the Canadian Forces example, right now we have a CDS who says that he is in charge of the bodily autonomy of everyone under his command.
Yes.
So if operational readiness is impacted by pregnancy, and it impacts either the pregnant member herself or the spouse of a pregnant woman who has to be brought back from deployment for the birth of the child, does that mean that everyone who serves in uniform has to be sterilized?
Right.
Well, the CDS says that medical treatment can be ordered.
Right.
According to what he says right now, that's what I'm challenging, is he does not have the right to make these kinds of orders, but that's what we're down to. So is a court going to say, well, it's an operational, this is interfering with the operation of our military, so yeah, he's allowed to do that because we take judicial notice that the military has to be ready to fight.
Right. And where do we
see how if you change what the topic is, all of a sudden it becomes, wait a minute, hold on, we're going to do mass sterilization to everybody in the forces.
Right.
People react quite strongly to that, and I'm like, well, tell me the difference.
Yeah, we had spoken a few days ago, and you had mentioned one of the senior staff in Ottawa, maybe it's the VCDS, had basically said that people don't have a right to bodily autonomy. Canadian Forces members.
That's the commander of our Navy.
The Navy
Admiral
commander.
Topshee.
Right, Topshee.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, basically there is no bodily autonomy in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Okay, so by extension of that, a sailor could go into his ready room and be forced to submit to sexual intercourse because there's no bodily autonomy in the Canadian Armed Forces. A senior officer has the right to rape their own soldiers based on that logic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's unbelievable that people get to this level, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and how do you, when you say it about something, you're not just, when there's a statement made by someone at the top level of our military says that. It's not just about one particular mandate or one particular medical treatment. This has implications for everything.
Yes.
Because their thinking is, we have absolute control over all of it. No, you don't, because everybody has their charter rights.
Yes.
No matter what. And so I think they need reminding of it, and that's where I come in. Because that's my job, is to remind them and make them. I want to make commanding officers think twice and say, if I do this, am I going to get sued for this? Because I'll tell you, from my nursing days, doctors and nurses are terrified of lawyers because they know that they can get sued if they don't do their job properly and keep their skills up, etc. And I think that would be a refreshing change in the Canadian Armed Forces because nothing else has worked. We've had how many commissions? Nothing changes. They think they're untouchable. They really do, and now it's time to teach them that there is some touchable. They're touchable.
I only left the military in 2015. In August, it'll be 8 years for me that I've left. And, my experience with the military was, as an officer, there's four things we have. We have mission, equipment, your men or women, and then yourself, your last. And it almost seems to me like we've inverted that whole thing. It's like my career, my mission, the equipment, and the last thing that I'm going to care about is the welfare of soldiers. And when I went through officer school, officer training in 1990 something, 8 or 9, 99, we had, the principles of leadership, and they've since been changed. But the one I remembered the most was know your soldiers and promote their welfare. That's a great thing on a little, placard that's hanging on the wall, the 10 principles of leadership. But it was never, from my experience, overly exercised in a practical way. After that, 2 years later, we went into war, full combat in Afghanistan and stuff. But and I suspect that leaders led by example, and they did promote the welfare of their people right up until the part when the military was gripped by all the fear porn coming out of the military. And then the very people that we expect to overcome fear and still use their cognitive ability succumb to it without question. And a lot of people out there that say, "Hey, no, screw these soldiers that don't want to participate. They're a soldier. They follow orders. That's what they signed up to do." Yes, in a time of war, in combat, when you're on a two-way range, when there's lead going in both directions, that is when it matters. That's when it counts.
Yes.
But in peacetime, you're still legally responsible for the welfare of your soldiers, even in war, but definitely in peacetime. I can't go and order my soldiers to go play in traffic. Go out there on the 401 and jump around like Frogger. Like I don't have the legal authority to do something so stupid. No. But yet, for the people out there that say soldiers follow orders, that's what you do. Well, remember one thing. First and foremost, these are human beings. These are people's sons and daughters, their children, their parents of children. These are Canadian citizens, and they are also protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country. They don't give up their charter rights just because they put on a uniform. They have to overcome adverse situations like the trauma of war. And in training is very dangerous. People get killed all the time in training. That's a fact of the job.
We just had a helicopter crash a day before yesterday.
Yes.
It was fatal.
It's a dangerous profession. But, if you're going to put on the uniform and risk your life, you have to know that you and your family are going to be taken care of if the worst should happen. And yet, that also includes while you're serving to be treated with dignity and to be treated with respect and, to be a value member of the team, but to be treated like a leper, bullied, harassed, and then discarded like you're garbage, even though you've served your country. I mean, all of these people, they all just want to serve their country, but they want to do it in a dignified way that is in a way that their rights are also being considered and upheld. But we're not seeing that happen in the Canadian military.
Right. And they want leaders that they know are looking out for them.
Yes.
Because the trust between the commands and the troops on the ground is gone.
It's gone.
Completely shattered because they don't trust each other.
No.
And if you don't trust each other, you don't have a military. And, because now you got people saying, well, if you'll order me to do that, what else? No.
Yeah. I mean, this is the same dynamic happening within the police departments as well. And, how do when we look at the idea of trust is something that you can degrade rapidly through example, right? So as an example, look at what all the police forces did with BLM. Not only were they violating their own lockdown policies, but they were out there in mass groups taking a knee for a known felon in a different country.
Yeah, a known
George
terrorist
Floyd,
group.
a known terrorist group.
Yeah.
I mean, Antifa is a terrorist group, and I don't care. I don't mind saying that out loud. BLM is, Antifa is the militant arm of BLM, or Antifa is. So, we're taking knees with a known terrorist group. So now you've got Canadian soldiers that are protesting
now, we
in
have
Ottawa.
a lieutenant colonel from we got a lieutenant colonel from Special Forces openly participating in BLM.
Yes. And yet
protest.
that same Special Forces unit fired 3 highly trained, very expensive operators, fired them because they were seen in Ottawa at the time of the convoy. They were kicked out of the unit. Now we've got a high-ranking officer from the same unit who was caught being on the side of Antifa at an anti-queer trans protest in Ottawa a few weeks ago. And the government has come out and said, no, he wasn't participating. Like, it's there. It's on video. The guy was there on video.
Very obvious.
And the woman he was
actively
yes. The woman he was standing behind, the crazy one. When I testified at the Public Order Emergency Commission, she was there for a week, and I would walk by. She knew who I was. I don't know how but she got off social media or whatever. She would scream at me and call me a traitor and a terrorist as I was walking by, and swear at me and say all sorts of vile things. Police knew she was there. Nobody removed her. But on the last day of the week she was there, she actually went inside the commission and sat in our seats, and security had to come and say, out you go. And now this is the one leading the charge against, parents that are just simply trying to protect their children from being groomed in schools.
Right.
And now you got a guy from the military who's backing it up, and the military is refusing to acknowledge that he even participated when it's right there on video. He was participating in it.
Yeah, like a senior officer.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
this is not some corporal who made a bad choice one day.
Exactly. So now,
because there's a certain expectation. I, as a Canadian citizen, I have a certain expectation of a senior officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that wasn't it.
Yeah. Now, what soldier in that unit?
You're also supposed to be apolitical.
Absolutely true. Apolitical. And that was one of the justifications for removing the 3 guys from that unit. But now here's the thing. That's a high readiness unit. What soldier in that unit is going to look at that guy and say, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to follow you. Meanwhile, you just kicked out three of our members, our ranks, for doing something far less than what you just got caught red-handed doing. Who's going to follow that guy? That's, what we refer to as a loss of confidence, and therefore you're removed from the chain of command because you've lost the confidence of your boss. This guy's lost the confidence of the troops that are expected to follow him, and he should be removed. Right.
Well, and Special Forces got hit hard by the directive. Very hard.
I saw the interview with Dallas Alexander that he did in the States with Sean Ryan. Devastating. Devastating. What's happening. These guys don't grow on trees.
Yeah.
No,
and they're very expensive to train.
Yeah.
We've lost over $3 billion in training.
Yes.
Just from the people that are listed as plaintiffs in my lawsuit.
Well, when you consider that from the time of the directives, there's releases, voluntary releases, retirements, and then 5F where they're kicking people out. What is that estimated to be somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000? Like when your military is as small as ours, when we, in relative terms to the New York City Police Department, and you lose 3,000 to 5,000 of your trained members, that's expensive. Where's the return on investment for the tax dollars? Where? And the capability.
None. Our capability is gone. It's gone. I mean, we've got about 3 snipers to cover all of Western Canada.
Yeah.
There was a Friday afternoon a couple of months ago where we had 3 jets with 3 pilots to defend our entire country.
Yeah. Well, the other...
I don't know if you've looked at a map lately, but we've got an awfully big country for 3 jets to cover.
Well, we don't even have sniper rifles because some of the units have had to turn them in so they could be sent to the Ukraine and given to Chrystia Freeland's family to defend her homeland, not ours. So... Yeah,
I mean, the people and equipment we could have had under good leadership with that kind of budget, we would have had an outstanding military. We'd have had ships that could and submarines that could actually sail. How about that?
Yeah.
Although they've lost a lot of really good mechanics, could keep those old ships afloat.
Yeah.
Those are the people they lost. You know,
when mandates first got imposed,
you notice it's not the Canadian military going to rescue those people off of Newfoundland that are in that sunk submarine. It's our sovereign waters, but we can't help them.
Yeah. When the mandates first came out for the military, I was sharing as far as wide as I could the case of Sergeant Kipling. Because I thought, okay, the precedent's already there. Like, this has gone to a court-martial. You've got a good defense here already. Make all of your memos, cite this as, Annex A to your memorandum. And a lot of people did that. And it went nowhere. It was thrown in the garbage. Why?
You know why? Because Kipling was charged under Section 126 of the National Defense Act, which allows the Chief of Defense Staff to demand that certain treatment to every member in the forces. And if you do not take it, you are in front of a court-martial, independent decision maker. And if you have a reason to not take it, then you're acquitted.
Right.
So he didn't use National Defense Act because they couldn't risk 3,000 courts-martial. First of all, the JAG is too small to handle that. But all it would take is one win, and Kipling becomes really solid, irrefutable law.
Right.
So they didn't. That's why I think they didn't use 126. Just around the same time as that previous grievance, or that other grievance we talked about, there was another grievance decision by the same committee that found that the grievance was successful because they found that AIR should have used Section 126.
Okay.
So he's getting a little hammered by the grievance committee. Here's the interesting thing. He's going to have to, now he's the final authority.
Right.
So the committee has recommended that these two people be successful in the grievances, which completely shatters his directives. He's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because if he signs off on it and agrees with the committee, he's admitting that he issued an unlawful order, and that whole house of cards collapses. Or if he says, no, I don't agree with the committee, it still stands, my decision still stands, he's caught because the committee said, hold on, and I get to ask him in questioning, why didn't you follow the advice of the committee? Because the committee has written very good decisions, like they're really well written.
Well, not only that, but he subverts the entire grievance principles, and you're not going to get any members of the Canadian Armed Forces that have any further trust or belief in the actual system to defend them if they have a grievance. So what you're going to have is, again, another mass exodus of people who don't believe the system is there and is fair and impartial, because you're seeing the final authority being the one who overrides the grievance committee. So, it's just more...
Well, but this is a question I have for the court: is who's the final authority on an order from the Chief of Defense Staff? Because there's no one higher than him to be the final authority on anything that he does. Like, that's a question that needs to be answered, in my opinion. That who overrides him when he makes a bad decision? You
would almost think it would have at least been the Minister of National Defense.
No, but she doesn't have jurisdiction over military matters.
Right. So
the National Defense Act doesn't give her that power. The only person who can countermand him would be the Governor General acting for the King, or the King himself.
Don't see that
because that's the Commander in Chief. No.
Yeah.
But is that the answer?
Right.
That, I think it is a fair question, and it needs to be answered.
Mm-hmm.
If we've got a chief of defense staff who issues an unlawful order,
Mm-hmm.
but signs off on agreements saying it's lawful order because I said it is.
Yeah. Well, the good news is
So,
that if you're outside of the military justice system now as a lawsuit, so this is
yes.
potentially something that could eventually be elevated to the Supreme Court of Canada, potentially.
It
So
could.
that takes that whole issue. It makes a very different route. But if you were to get to the Supreme Court on this issue, this is something that's going to have lasting consequences for for decades to come. If
Yes.
as a country we have decades, I'm going to leave that one alone.
That's a good question.
Yeah. So
Talk about another day.
yeah, exactly. I put out a video on Twitter yesterday talking about the future of government in Canada. I've got ideas, but I don't have solutions. But anyway, I'm not going to go down that road right now. And I think what I'm going to do, because we've been going for a pretty good hour now, what I'd like to do is, instead of continuing talking about this, I'd like to bring you back on the show at another time. Maybe you can give us an update on how things are going. Maybe in the fall or at some point when you're cross-examining some of the key leadership within the Canadian military. And we can definitely dig into those issues once we get more clarity on the state of the Canadian forces.
Right.
So and again, you've been extremely generous with your time throughout. I really want to thank you, but we're going to keep an eye on this, and I think this is very, very important stuff, because it's not the government of Canada's Canadian Armed Forces. It is the people of Canada's defense line. It is the people's Canadian forces. And they have a right to know on the state of the Canadian military and what the leadership and what the government is doing to their military that is assigned to protect them. And so this is a very important case, and I hope that Canadians pay close attention to it. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but your law firm is Valour. Sorry, I refer to it as Valour Law, but there's a longer legal action center, Valour Legal Action Centre.
Yeah, that's the nonprofit that
Right.
I started to bring some of these bigger cases.
Okay.
Because when you're going up against the government, their favorite tactic is to run you out of money.
Yes.
So I developed a nonprofit to do these big cases.
And are you fundraising? Any of your?
We are.
You are. Okay.
Yes, we are.
And where
Yes.
where do Canadians or anybody who wants to help fund this? Where do they go to help donate or fund the legal action against the government?
So if they go to valourlegalactioncentre.org,
.org.
the donation link is on the
Okay.
website. And it's the Valour's with a U and Centre is R-E.
Okay.
So it's a Canadian spelling.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And it's Valour, not Valour.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
So.
we will post the link to that donation, and if any of the viewers choose to help out with this legal case, and I hope that they do. We at Veterans for Freedom, and I've got to do a Jeremy McKenzie thing the other day. I had him on there, and he pulled out his V4F coffee cup like it was a sponsored commercial. So I've got to do mine.
Yeah.
But we've started veteransforfreedom.ca, a fund. And what we're doing with this fund is we're asking Canadians to sign up for a monthly donation of $5. All that money goes into a pot, a high interest bank account. And we're letting the members, the donors, decide every 30 days. They're going to get a survey and look at all the different causes that we want to help fund. So if we raise some money every 30 days, we figure out, okay, these are the list of causes we want to donate to. And the donors get to vote on where they want to send that money. So I'm really hoping that, this lawsuit makes it onto the survey, and the donors decide, okay, this is a good cause to protect those active duty and veterans. So, that's veteransforfreedom.ca under the fund. And then I will post the link to your website as well, if viewers just want to donate directly to your lawsuit. And I think that'd be a great idea as well. So
yeah, it's very much appreciated.
Yes.
Because even just, I have 150,000 pages of evidence. That takes a lot of paper and ink.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It certainly does.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna do a shout out. If there's any lawyers in the Edmonton area that want to help out, that want to get involved and see what's really going on, and maybe they were just looking for an opportunity to do more than just their everyday legal work. There might be some special lawyers out there that are looking to get into the fight and do something meaningful that are in your area. That
actually
maybe can
anywhere.
help.
Yeah, they can be from anywhere in Canada because we're in the federal court.
Right.
So we're not restricted to certain provinces.
Okay, good.
For a law license, as long as you have a license in one province, you can appear in front of the federal court.
Right.
So,
okay. So
and remote work is our lives these days.
It is. It is.
So.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to leave it there. And again, thank you so much for your time. This has been really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Okay.